Thanks for listening to this archive of our webinar, Thinking About the 1619 Project, hosted by Dr. Jeff Sickinga, Professor of Political Science at Ashland University and Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center, with panelists Dr. Jason Stevens, Professor of Political Science at Ashland University, and Dr. Lucas Morrell of Washington and Lee University.
Hi, I'm Jeff Sickinga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center. Here at Ashland University in Ashland, Ohio. As many of you joining us know, the Ashbrook Center is an independent educational center located here at Ashland University on the campus. We have programs for undergraduate students here at the university, and high school students, but also programs around the country for students, teachers, and citizens. And so we're so glad that folks from around the country are joining us today for this very important webinar on thinking about the 1619 project. So delighted that you could be with us. We really think of this webinar and all the webinar series that we've been doing lately as part of our mission. You know, when Ashbrook was founded in 1983 by President Ronald Reagan, our mission then, as it is now, was to strengthen constitutional self-government by educating our fellow Americans in the history and principles of our country and in the habits necessary for self-government. So we take that mission very seriously. We think of this webinar as part of that ongoing mission and carrying it out that we've been doing now for over 37 years. And we are so delighted today to be joined by a couple of scholars who have spent a long time thinking hard about American history and government, and thinking hard about the fundamental principles of this country. You know, the Ashbrook way of teaching and learning is to have a conversation. You know, we don't think of education as simply information, and we certainly don't think of it as indoctrination. We think of it as discovery, discovering the truth for yourself by having conversations with the great minds of the past, conversation with your fellow citizens, and conversations with the kind of scholars that we have with us today. So we hope that you'll join us in that conversation. Please feel free to submit your questions. We'll try to get to as many of those as possible. This is such a lively, interesting, and even controversial topic that I know we'll have those. And today, joining me in that conversation are two old friends of the Ashbrook Center and two people who have been participating in our programs for many years now. Dr. Jason Stevens is and has been a professor here at Ashland University in the Department of History and Political Science for almost 10 years now. He received his BA from Ashland. In fact, he was an Ashbrook Scholar, which just shows that you can make it good if you're an Ashbrook Scholar. And then he went on to get his master's and PhD from the Institute for Philosophic Studies at the University of Dallas. And then after teaching a few other places, came to rejoin us here at Ashland and work at the Ashbrook Center. And he's been a regular teacher, not just of undergraduates, but also in our graduate programs, in our Master of Arts in American History and Government, which is a wonderful graduate program for teachers, and also in our Teaching American History program. Our TAH programs take seminars around the country, empowering teachers with a great understanding of American history and principles. And Jason has been deeply involved in teaching in those programs for many years. And now he has become, in fact, Ashbrook's Director of Teacher Programs. So he is supervising the carrying out of all of our programs reaching out to teachers. He has written and done his dissertation on Abraham Lincoln and is a real expert in American political thought. He's taught courses in graduate level courses and undergraduate level courses on things like the American Revolution, the American founding, the U.S. Constitution, and American political thought. So he is well versed in our topic for today. Our other panelist joining us is Dr. Lucas Morrell. Lucas is professor of politics and head of the politics department at Washington and Lee University in Virginia. His bachelor's is from Claremont McKenna College out in California, and his master's and PhD are from the Claremont Graduate University. Uh, like Jason, Lucas is also a professor in our Master of Arts in American History and Government and in our TAH programs. He's been doing that for a number of years, as I said, teaching courses like Race and Equality in America, the Civil War, Reconstruction, and a wonderful course on the American novelist Ralph Ellison. In fact, I think Lucas likes Ralph Ellison so much he named one of his children after him. That's a high tribute. And some of you who have been able to join us for our Rediscovering America weekend last will recognize Professor Morrell. He joined us there to talk about Abraham Lincoln, which is a very fitting topic because Lucas is one of the country's foremost experts on the life and thought of Abraham Lincoln. He has published a number of articles and books on Lincoln. I think he's edited at least 2 books on Ralph Ellison and published at least 3 more on Abraham Lincoln. And his latest book, in fact, on Lincoln, which is called Lincoln and the American Founding, is coming out in this next month, in June 2020. I think he told me June 9th. So very soon, we're going to get another wonderful book on Abraham Lincoln and his connection to an understanding of the American founding, which is a wonderful and rich topic. So we're so delighted that Lucas could be here. He has held a number of other positions. He's been the past president of the Abraham Lincoln Institute. He's a trustee of the United States Supreme Court Historical Society. And he's also a member of the U.S. Commission on the 250th anniversary of the country. Mm-hmm. So this is a person who has a deep understanding of American history, but is also living it out in the public realm today. So thank you both, Jason and Lucas, for joining us today. Really glad that you could be here for this topic. And maybe, Lucas, we'll just start with you. Sure. And throw out this question, because some of folks joining us probably know a lot about the 1619 Project, and some folks may not know quite as much. Just take a step back and tell us, what is the 1619 Project? And who's responsible for it, and sort of what is its purpose?
The 1619 Project is an outreach by the New York Times working with a journalism organization called the Pulitzer Center. It's not the organization that produces the prize. We'll get back to that in a bit. But they found someone to curate this project, a recipient of the Macarthur Fellowship, sometimes known as the Macarthur Genius Grant. Her name is Nikole Hannah-Jones. She's a journalist, an investigative journalist. And what she has led is a group of individuals who are exploring the impact of what we call today the legacy of slavery and the way that racism has impacted the development socially and politically of the United States. Why is it called the 1619 Project? In the lead essay, Nikole Hannah-Jones, it's an essay of about 7,300 words, argues that 1776 shouldn't be considered the center or the essence of what it means, what America means. That the defining moment for America was not the signing of the Declaration of Independence, was not the American Revolutionary War, but rather something that happened way back before the United States was a gleam in anybody's eye. In August of August of 1619, what some people argue were 20 African slaves were traded into a location near the Jamestown colony. There are some scholars that debate that conclusion, but let's just go with that. So the argument is that the planting of 20 African slaves on America's shores indelibly infected or insinuated its way into the mores, habits, ways of thinking, and of course, practice of America, and eventually what became the United States of America. And so she wants to, and the New York Times echoes this, they want to reframe how Americans, and therewith the world, understand what it is that is central to this country. And for them, it is not what we grew up learning was the spirit of 76. What Lincoln understood was human equality. Rather, and in fact, if you go to Nikole Hannah-Jones's Twitter page, she has 1776 crossed out, and underneath it is 1619. So even though her essay on 1619, the centrality of that event, even though the essay says that 1619 is the equivalent of 1776, her Twitter page has 1776 crossed out. She is emphatic about saying that essentially racism, and to be more specific, white supremacy is, as she says in her article, rooted so deeply in the American ethos that it is part of our DNA. And so her essay and other essays and creative productions and images, photographs, etc., these are all devoted to, as I mentioned, the deep, long, and almost ineradicable shadow that racial slavery has cast on this country.
That's very helpful. And is it also true that there's this lead essay, and then there are a number of other essays that the New York Times published back in August of 2019,
yes,
which would be, as you say, the 400th anniversary, almost to the day of the introduction of slavery, at least according to some folks in Virginia. And then it's also true, am I right to say that the 1619 Project since then has come to direct itself and its gaze toward education in universities,
correct,
and in particular in K through 12, and they are producing a curriculum for schools to teach this to students. Is that also true?
Yeah, the curriculum is already produced. And in fact, if you go to their website, the Pulitzer Center's website, you can see what lesson plans, reading guides, key terms, extend the lessons that they have. There's also an invitation to teachers to submit what they have been doing in their own school districts or in their own classes to weave into their teaching of civics in history the basic lessons and themes of the 1619 Project. So this is not something prospective. This is something that has already occurred, and it's occurred in a number of states, a number of school districts, and it's already having the impact that the New York Times has intended. They're not waiting for the universities and colleges to pick this up. They're trying to shape the minds and hearts of students at the K through 12 level.
So if I can, and this is for both you, Lucas, you and Jason, I was looking at this essay that you referred to, Lucas, by Nikole Hannah-Jones, and if I could just read a few sentences and just get your and Jason's thoughts on this, because as you've outlined so well, its purpose. But here's, as she lays it out, here's the 1619 Project's basic argument, and she says, the United States is a nation founded on both an ideal and a lie. Our Declaration of Independence, improved on July 4th, 1776, proclaims that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Then she says, but the white men who drafted those words did not believe them to be true for the hundreds of thousands of black people in their midst. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness did not apply to fully 1/5 of the country. Yet, despite being violently denied the freedom and justice promised to all, Black Americans believe fervently in the American creed. Through centuries of Black resistance and protest, we have helped the country live up to its founding ideals. That seems to me to be one of the core arguments of the 1619 Project, that the founders didn't really believe in these principles or didn't believe that they applied to all people, and that has been the struggle of Black Americans since 1776 to try and make that true. That was once a lie, as she puts it. Can you comment on, is there anything more that we need to know or understand about the basic argument that they're putting forward here?
Jason, you want to take a stab at that first?
Yeah, I could say a little bit about that. I think the fundamental question that the 1619 Project presents is, when was the country founded? Was it 1776 or was it 1619? And the answer that the 1619 Project delivers on that question, right? Obviously, we see, right, just by the name of the thing, how the authors of this project, how they would answer that question. The argument is that, well, Jeff, you just read it for us, that the founding principles were wrong when they were written. founding principles were wrong when they were written in the Declaration of Independence in 1776, meaning that America's true founding is not 1776, but instead 1619, with the coming of the first slaves to America's shores. That the history of America, that its founding, that its birth, it was birthed in slavery, not freedom. Right? If that's true, right, that is a fundamental transformation of the regime, of how we understand the regime as far as its origins. That America is not, right, the land of the free, but is the land of the slave, and it can't be. Right, those two things cannot coexist. Right, the 1619 Project tosses out the ideals of the nation, tosses out that it was founded in freedom, and instead says, no, you really want to understand America, you have to understand 1619. I think that, right, for those who would locate the birth of the nation to 1776, that doesn't exclude what happened in 1619. Right, that doesn't ignore the huge problem of slavery in the country. But the 1619 Project does ignore 1776, or at least would argue that it's obsolete. And right, maybe we can say more about that, but I want to give Lucas time here to jump in with his thoughts as well.
Yeah, the great difficulty that she has here, and this is indicative of the problem of civic education in the United States today, is she fundamentally does not understand the nature of our regime as a self-governing regime. She is fixated on equality, which she should be, as any good American should be, any Lincolnian American should be. But she thinks that because the declaration that all men are created equal did not, in fact, practically secure the equality of the exercise of rights that we have by nature immediately for everybody. She does not understand. She draws from that. Therefore, it was never meant to be something that everybody possessed, and therefore everybody deserved protection from their government. She trips up over the principle of consent and does not duly appreciate how much one had to persuade one's fellow citizens in order to secure justice. She thought it was sufficient, or should be sufficient, simply to state what is true, that white supremacy isn't true, that all men really are created equal. She thought that simply by saying that or writing that, it should have immediately happened and been practical for everybody. And because it didn't, therefore it was a lie. Therefore, it was never intended for everybody. And she does not understand that you could have a just end like equality, but that there are also just means towards that end. And because she doesn't understand how the founders grappled with that and tried to set up institutions as well as principles in order to carry out justice over time through persuasion, through consent of the governed, she likens herself, and Jason could speak to this as well, to the old school abolitionists who thought it was sufficient simply to declare the truth of the matter as they understood it, with God as their witness, and let justice be done though the heavens fall. In other words, all that was necessary was to point out the sins of one's neighbors, and then wait for mirabile dictu, wait for that dictum simply to become reality. And because she doesn't understand consent, she doesn't understand the just requirement that equality be the product of consent, she finds herself, interestingly enough, ironically enough, in the same camp as people she condemns, like Roger Brooke-Taney, the Chief Justice of the United States, who argued that there was no rights that the black man had that whites were bound to respect. She actually finds herself in the camp of Lincoln's rival, Stephen Douglas, who was a rank categorical white supremacist. She actually puts herself in the camp of those who judge the founding as not a time where white Americans realized that the fundamental basis of their rights was their humanity and not their race, but rather that it was because they were whites that therefore they deserved the protection of their rights. It's really peculiar that she's making an argument on behalf of blacks that was the exact argument that was made for whites to protect their own rights. So she has some fundamental and basic either misunderstandings or, we'll just leave it at that, misunderstanding of the nature of self-governing regimes. And unfortunately, we find her argument unspools for 7,000 words after that premise.
So can I tackle that last point a little bit that both you and Jason
Sure.
raised, which is that these folks, as I think their connection to the New York Times suggests, these folks are journalists. And in fact, one of our attendees has asked this question. And it seem like one of the core problems of the 1619 Project is its goal is to reframe American history, but it's not really being done by historians or folks like you and Jason who have spent your lives and your careers studying and thinking about America and its history. It's really done by journalists, poets, essayists, photographers. That's all part of this. And I just wonder if we see that, and I'm wondering then, do we see that in the essays themselves, a kind of journalistic tendency? You know, she was talking about Monticello, and I just had to write this down because it struck me. She said, talking about Jefferson's home, Monticello, which probably some people listening to have visited, very beautiful spot. She calls it the forced labor camp Jefferson called Monticello. That's the kind of thing that incendiary polemical talk, right, that journalists are good at. And I know since this has come out, there have been historians, people who are definitely not on the right in their politics, so not conservatives, who would call themselves liberals, who have been critical of this project because they say that they're journalists who are trying to do history. Could you talk a little bit more, maybe Lucas, starting with you, about that, and what have some of the criticisms of this as history have been?
Well, what we've learned since, and because she has been pinned on this, she's had to explain the extent to which it is historical. I'll say two things. At one panel, she said just straight out, "This is not history." I'm quoting her verbatim. "This is not history. It's about reparations." And so she has at least been honest about the objective of the project. The objective of the project isn't really, although this will be a means to her end, the objective of the project really isn't to correct our history. It is to provide a history that will enable a political result to happen. And that result is systemic change so that today's generation and future generations of Blacks will receive compensation for what happened to their ancestors. That's what we know as reparations. The means to that is shaping public opinion, because of course, no laws are going to be passed until you change people's opinion. So for starters, her claim to the historicity of her facts is she says, it's not history. So she's defending the fact that she's a journalist. She doesn't have a PhD in history, although she hastens to add her bachelor's is in history. So it's not history. Then she says, all history is revisionism, which is her way of saying, well, you have your history, I have my history, I can come up with experts, you can come up with experts, so we'll just see which history, and you got to put that in scare quotes now, because it isn't rooted in facts, it's rooted in interpretations of facts and mere interpretations. So her hope is, and recently winning a Pulitzer helps, her hope is if her rendering of history, which did get the help of some historians, I'm going to hasten to say something about that in a second, if her rendering of history is successful, it really doesn't matter if it's true or not. The point is, do we believe it? And if as a nation we believe it, if its racism is rooted in our DNA, as she wrote, then of course you can't just racism in this country isn't about David Duke. It isn't about this organization or that person. It's about a structural problem or deficiency that has to be changed. And if you're talking structural change, that's not a law. That's something a little more revolutionary than simply reform or a law, although the starting point would be a law with regards to reparations. So let me quickly add about the historians. After the fact, she needed to bone up or dress up the historical bona fides of her article, because she got hammered from libertarians, from conservatives, and from liberals who have PhDs in the subject for how bad, flawed, deficient, full of half-truths, vulgarizations, misquotations, and outright untruths. She had to shore up her bona fides as at least as a historical account that was accurate. And she said, well, I did have a group of historians vet not just her article, but the articles that dealt with capitalism, that dealt with American history, you name it. One of those historians has since published an article that said, yeah, she asked my opinion and I pointed out errors. And my pointing those errors out was ignored. And so again, this isn't some right-wing cabal. It isn't some libertarian maneuver to try to get her to change her mind. That's not going to happen. It was by someone who was actually asked by the project to see if the historical claims were correct, and her opinion about it, her educated opinion about it, was dismissed.
So if I can continue on that, then what do you find, you both, and this is, I guess, for both of you, because when I'm reading through it, I'm finding that some really notable figures are absent from her story. Right? Some really important figures that, you know, when we run our programs at Ashbrook, we would always want to make sure some of these people are in there, because her essay almost seems like it's, you know, as a matter of history, as you're pointing out some of the inaccuracies. The other problem, as we know from sort of being teachers of history and students of history, it's very hard to reduce everything that happens to one cause. So they want to say 1619 is the one cause of everything. And then the rest of the essays, as you say, are sort of, here's how it causes the music in America, art in America, capitalism in America, you name it, it's all caused or influenced by this fundamental fact. And of course, history is usually more complicated, a little messier than that. And American history in particular, as we know, is really often a debate. You know, if you think about the American founding, you might have had a lot of people in the American founding agreeing. You know, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams agreed on independence and on fundamental principles, but then they started fighting right after that, right? James Madison and Alexander Hamilton agreed. And then in the 1790s, they viciously fought each other over what this meant for America. You know, we have the debates between, you know, you have people who are abolitionists who oppose slavery in the 19th century and they want to get rid of it. But they are really at odds, people like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. So yes, there's these whole series of debates in America that she sort of doesn't bring up the one other side of the debate that's always been there and always been present. And so I'm wondering if you both could comment on who are some of the important figures in the American story and in the debates that she just doesn't deal with and simply omits.
Yeah, I guess I'll take a stab at that, because I think that has a lot to do with Lucas's point that he brought up earlier about the 1619 Project finding itself in the same camp as Roger Taney or Stephen Douglas. I was before COVID-19 hit, one of the last teacher programs that I participated in before we all had to hunker down inside. I forget where it was, but I met with a fantastic group of teachers, and the topic was causes of the Civil War. And we conducted that seminar like we do all of our Ashbrook teacher seminars. We sit down with some original documents, some great primary text in the history of America, and we just read them together. And we have a conversation with each other, as you mentioned, Jeff. Conversations develop between the teachers, between the discussion leader and the teachers, but primarily the conversation emerges between the student and the text. And in that seminar, we started off by reading the Declaration of Independence, 1776. And when Jefferson writes in that second paragraph, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. And that starts off this conversation among the teachers about the nature of equality and liberty. And well, you know, what did the founders mean when they said all men are created equal? And that conversation developed among the teachers, and somebody says, well, you know, obviously, Jefferson owned slaves, so he couldn't really have meant what he said in the Declaration. He probably meant all white men are created equal. They did not mean to include the black man. And another teacher pipes off to the side, joining the conversation, says, yeah, I heard about that sort of an argument. I read about that in, there's this new project, did any of you hear about, from the Washington Post called the 1619 Project? Then another teacher jumps into the conversation and says, no, I read that, but it was the New York Times, not the Washington Post. And the conversation developed around the 1619 Project. And some of the teachers said, yeah, that sounds right, what the arguments that the 1619 Project is making. And that develops out of reading the text of the Declaration. And the approach I took was, okay, that's interesting. That's the debate. That's the question. 1619 or 1776? When was the birth of the nation? When was America founded? And my recommendation was, heck, let's just keep reading. Let's see what some of these great thinkers in American history and the history of American political thought had to say about that question, because I think maybe they'll provide an answer for us. So we just, we kept reading, right? So we end up, going through some of these documents. We read John C. Calhoun, right? The advocate of the positive good theory of slavery, that slavery is not a necessary evil, but that slavery is a positive good. It's good for the master and it's good for the slave, right? Calhoun, a very prominent Southern politician who, even though he dies in 1850, his ideas provided a justification for Southern secession in the 1860s. We read Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Southern Confederacy. And both of these men, Calhoun and Stephens, we find in their arguments, we read the Oregon Bill from Calhoun, we read a speech on abolition petitions from Stephens, we read his famous Cornerstone Address. And the teachers, we're just exploring these texts together. We find that it's Calhoun and Stephens who are arguing that if you want to understand America, it all goes back to 1619. That the founding principles were wrong when they were written. And that's why, we need to break away from America, because, we need to preserve slavery. And that's what the real America is all about. And the teachers who maybe at the beginning of the seminar were somewhat sympathetic to the 1619 Project, they read these words of Calhoun and Stephens, these great defenders of American slavery. And they say, well, hold on a second. These guys are saying America was founded in 1619 and we need to reject 1776. That's the claim of the New York Times and the 1619 Project. Their arguments are coming out of the mouths of Calhoun and Stephens, in the mid 19th century, long before this project comes out in the modern day. And well, that's a little unsettling, to find out that your views are maybe coming out of the mouths of guys like John C. Calhoun and Alexander Stephens. So, well, okay, let's continue the conversation. Then we read Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. We have somebody, read the Gettysburg Address out loud. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. 16, and we do the math, 77 years ago. So what is Lincoln saying? Where would Lincoln place the founding of the nation? We 77 years, 87 years, 1863, 1776. Abraham Lincoln argues that America was founded not in 1619, but in 1776. And now if you're sympathetic to the 1619 Project, all of a sudden now you find yourself opposed to Abraham Lincoln and how Lincoln understands the Union. And you're on the side of Calhoun and Stephens. Just seeing that conversation develop between these minds through these documents, you begin to enter into their own conversation, their own debate. This is an old debate, Make no mistake. This is not a new debate about 1619 versus 1776. And reading those documents, you become a part of that conversation. And the teachers who may have been, more sympathetic to 1619, to the claims of the 1619 Project, realize through those documents they get a better understanding of history through the words of those who lived it, and they come to maybe rethink some of their opinions. And that's what we're trying to do by engaging with teachers and talking about original primary documents in American history, to be a part of those conversations, because We are trying to get answers to some really difficult questions, and those documents can help us do that.
Yeah, I would add, try to make this quick, to your question, Jeff, about who's left out. I would add that one of the major things, in fact, the thread of the essay is a relationship she has with her father, who is a Black man, as she is, obviously, who flew the American flag proudly, and she did not understand that growing up. How could a man who had been discriminated against, even when he was in the Army, a man who knew the racism that was still alive and unfortunately well in his life, what did he like so much about America? And she finally comes around to seeing things his way because she sees something he saw, which is the role that Black people played in developing this country socially, culturally, politically. Super important point. Not a point that's new to her. Ralph Ellison said it before her. W.E.B. Du Bois said it before him. Frederick Douglass said it before him. So we can go back. And this series of great Black American intellectual lights and activists who have all understood the role that Black people have played in the long march of civil rights, as I consider our history. But the problem is, she's really not interested in simply adding to the narrative or to the story. She's interested in replacing the narrative. And who she studiously avoids that's the tell. If you play poker, that's the inadvertent sign of what she's up to, that this is not history. As you put it, Jeff, it is polemics. It is polemical. And it verges on propaganda. Why? You get to the end of the essay, and she brings you to the present. She starts back in 1619 and marches her way to the present. So the things she mentions are important, and the things she omits are important. That's why I call it a series of half-truths. Why doesn't she mention Frederick Douglass? Why does she not highlight the most famous person who emerges out of the modern civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr.? She omits them, I argue, and I'm speculating because I haven't heard her address this, but I'm speculating she omits them precisely because of what they saw in the founding, not in 1619, but in 1776. They understood that in spite of the failures of that generation and subsequent ones of completely living up to the truths that they uttered in letters, in speeches, in government documents, that despite the ways they fell short of the standard, that standard was true, and it was true for everybody. King saw it that way. Frederick Douglass saw it that way. He referred to them as saving principles. King, of course, referred to it as the American creed. And these are so obviously missing that there has to be a theme here that she is trying to keep intact that would be disturbed and disrupted if she included them. She could not keep Frederick Douglass. She could not mention or highlight King, because if she did, she would be quoting and highlighting people who loved the founding, not the failures of the founding, but the successes. And she does not want that to be the case. And so omitting them, omitting the role that white abolitionists along with Black abolitionists played, I mean, this is a very strange argument she makes. This goes back to what Jason was saying in terms of reframing it to 1619. If 1619 was the true founding, how does she explain 1776? What on earth possessed them to utter something that is categorically contrary to white supremacy? They didn't found the nation in 1776 or attempt to establish their independence from Great Britain by citing race. They cited humanity. All men are created equal, understanding human beings even before governments are established. If 1619 is true, 1776 would have been impossible. It would not have been born here. It would have been born somewhere else. What makes 1776 so singular is precisely that it did not continue an alleged march of white supremacy beginning in 1619. It's what's remarkable, and here, unfortunately, her historians, if she doesn't want to take the responsibility, okay, let's look at her historians. Her historians failed her by not pointing out that the slave-owning founders, Washington, Madison, Jefferson, the biggies, not the marginal ones, the biggies, these slave owners, to a man, never denied and in fact affirmed the natural rights of all human beings, including Black people. She just does not understand or appreciate that there were, in their minds, impediments, obstacles to securing the practical equality of what all human beings possessed naturally as human beings. She just does not understand that. And therefore, what we get from her are very selective quotations, sometimes out of context, and almost always omitting very important context or other information, even from someone like Jefferson, who she doesn't like. I mean, she likes the fact that he said all men are created equal, doesn't like that he enslaved Black people. I'm with her there. But she never shows that she knows that in Jefferson's own letters and public documents, he affirms the natural rights, what he calls in the draft of the Declaration, the sacred rights of Africans who were brought over here through Middle Passage. That has to be deliberate. And to leave that out is not, it's not doing bad history, it's worse. It is engaging in propaganda.
And perhaps, as you suggested before, it's not a misguided effort that is done in earnest, but may even be in a certain way in bad faith or have political ends.
Sure.
Let me ask you this then. You're both you and Jason. There's a couple of important figures that she brings up in her essay that you both argue are missing or very incomplete. And I know some people out there would be very interested to know. So what's a better way to look at the American founding and slavery? You know, if you look at it through the arguments of someone like Frederick Douglass, the great Black abolitionist, if you look at it through someone like Abraham Lincoln, or even through the founders themselves, what's a better way to understand, a truer way to understand the problem of slavery and the principles of the American founding? Could you give us some sense? Maybe start with you, Lucas, some sense of that?
Yeah, and I think you set this up nicely when you mentioned what we were doing in a way emulates what the founders were doing. It was a conversation. Anyone who teaches American history, and I'm only going to speak to the thing that I've studied, I haven't studied global history, but anyone who teaches American history and the students are never aware that it was a debate that produced the founding, a debate that produced the early republic, a debate that ultimately failed and produced the Civil War, right? That's the greatest tragedy of the Civil War, was we were unable to resolve our differences, our disagreements, our fundamental disagreements at a certain point in time. Some of us were unwilling to align our practice with our profession and therefore change their profession to align with their practice. Namely, I can't get rid of, as a white person, enslaving Black people, so I'm going to reject all men are created equal and tout the white supremacy line. Anyone who learns about American history and doesn't see that it is a product of a discussion among human beings who have honest disagreements about the nature of human beings, civil society, the purpose of government, is receiving a deficient education in history, and the effects are going to be found in our civics as well. And so how to teach this? Yes, please talk about the ways that Jefferson continued to enslave Black people after he said all men are created equal, and have them read his letters, for example, to John Holmes in 1820 during the Missouri Compromise, where he talks about the difficulty of recognizing that it would be just for his own slaves to revolt against him and the whites who legally owned them. It would be justice for them to exact revenge for the injustice committed through slavery, but the whites are fending them off, not because it is right in principle, but because they are fearing for their lives. It would produce a race war, is what Jefferson is saying, if we facilitated immediate mass emancipation without dealing with what he calls 10,000 recollections on the part of the Blacks. So you make it an interesting conversation by bringing in Jefferson's own awareness that what he is doing is wrong. That is not emphasized in her essay. She would get that also from Washington. She would get it from Madison. And that, I mean, this is where history gets really interesting. her essay pales in comparison in terms of being an engrossing read or an account of our history, precisely because it leaves out more than half of the story. And let me make one other point that isn't mentioned enough. She keeps responding to the claims that, well, look, you leave out all these abolitionists who were white. Weren't there decent white people in our history? And she says, look, we've heard enough about white people. I'm trying to make the case for what blacks have done for this country. But what she does not account for in her essay is their numerical minority efforts to produce a greater alignment of practice with profession would have accomplished nothing but for majority white sentiment on their side. If white Americans, the majority of them, were as indelibly infected by racism towards blacks, their overtures to them to live up to the Constitution, live up to the Declaration would have fallen on deaf ears. The very progress we have experienced as a country, beginning in 1776 all the way to the present, was, yes, a progress fomented by the contributions of blacks, but massively aided by the majority white population around them. But for that population, you would not have the changes in Massachusetts that provided emancipation, that would have provided emancipation in 5 other states of the original 13. You wouldn't have had Lincoln's efforts to steer us away from white supremacy, which is where Stephen Douglas wanted to go, let alone Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens. You wouldn't have had the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. You wouldn't have had, fast forward to the civil rights era of the 60s. How could you have a 1964 Civil Rights Act with the contributions of blacks when not a single senator was black at the time and very few black representatives in the House? How could you have had in the following year a Voting Rights Act, 1965, unless there was a whole lot of white people of goodwill who were either leading or seconding the efforts of King, Rosa Parks, and others for their just, as King put it, citizenship rights? That part she leaves out is more than half of what she leaves out, and good history cannot leave out this essential part of our history.
Jason, can I just jump in and direct this to you then, because you and Lucas have both done a lot of work on Lincoln, and one of the people that she tells, I think that Lucas would certainly say she sort of tells half-truths about, is Abraham Lincoln in this essay. How did Lincoln understand the problem of slavery in America and the need to sort of, as he calls it, make progress on the issue of race? Because as you said, you talked about the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln dates America from 1776. He says these principles were true. The American founders believed in them. But then a lot of people out there would say, so what happened? How did we not fully live up to those? And how did Lincoln understand that? Because in her essay, she seems to suggest Lincoln didn't care about that. He opposed slavery in principle, but he really didn't want to do anything about it. He wasn't interested in it. Again, completely contrary to what someone like Frederick Douglass said, who said Lincoln was at the head of this. But how did Lincoln, Jason, understand the problem of slavery, and why is that a good way to look at this issue? Because again, that's a question that always comes up in our teacher seminars, it comes up with undergraduate students, and now certainly it comes up in American schools.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Jeff. According to the 1619 Project, Lincoln is in the same vein as white supremacists, that he never really cared much for the slave, that he never really cared much about slavery. Again, that's not a new argument, right? There have been others who have made those claims about Lincoln in the past. But the answer to your question goes back to what we've been going back to this entire session. It goes back to the original primary documents. Well, let's see what Lincoln actually said. Let's see what he actually did. Did he do anything about slavery? Did he do enough? What did he say about slavery? How did he say it? Right? It's one thing to make a claim about somebody that you can grab from a textbook that's not backed up by primary documents. But when you go to the primary sources, right, you can actually have a conversation with Abraham Lincoln. You can ask him that question. So I would say, let's go to the documents and ask him that question. Lincoln, what did you think about slavery? What did you think about the American founding principles and the failure of the founders to completely live up to those principles in practice, what would Lincoln say? Well, you can go to his reply to Dred Scott from 1857, where he talks about the Declaration of Independence setting up a standard maxim, right? It's something that we're trying to live up to, something that we're trying to achieve, even though maybe never perfectly attained, right? Constantly approximated. We're constantly moving towards that goal. We're constantly trying to live up, right? Through this struggle, we're trying to live up to our founding principles. You can go to his 1854 Peoria address, speech on the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, where he says this, and I think this is directly related to the point you raised, Jeff. This is Lincoln, right? Somebody who, right, according to the 1619 Project, didn't care much about slavery, didn't care about the slave, and was a white supremacist. Here's what Lincoln has to say about that. Towards the end of the speech, Lincoln says, "Our Republican robe is soiled and trailed in the dust. Let us repurify it. Let us turn and wash it white in the spirit, if not the blood, of the Revolution. Let us turn slavery from its claims of moral right back upon its existing legal rights and its arguments of necessity. Let us return it to the position our fathers gave it, and there let it rest in peace. Let us readopt the Declaration of Independence, and with it the practices and policy which harmonize with it. Let North and South, let all Americans, let all lovers of liberty everywhere join in the great and good work. If we do this, we shall not only have saved the Union, but we shall have so saved it as to make and keep it forever worthy of the saving. We shall have so saved it that the succeeding millions of free, happy people the world over shall rise up and call us blessed to the latest generations." So slavery is a stain on America's Republican robe, he says. Lincoln's argument is, right, slavery, it has tarnished America. How do you solve that problem? You go to 1776, you go to the Declaration of Independence, you go to the principles of the Founding Fathers, right, to wash white our Republican robe. Then and only then, right, will the Declaration of Independence and its principles truly be alive in the life of the nation. And we've got to do that. And it focuses on, right, well, the problem is slavery. How do we solve slavery? Lincoln's argument, the great emancipator, and what will lead eventually, right, to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, as Lucas mentioned, right, you get that, Lincoln says, because of 1776. Without 1776, that's impossible.
So it really does seem like in critical moments in American history, whether it's the founding itself, whether it's the Civil War, whether it's the Civil Rights Movement, it sounds like what you're arguing, we both are saying, is that in those critical moments, that it's really people looking back at 1776.
Yes.
And trying to recapture the meaning of those and keep those alive and sort of bring that spirit and those principles to the current moment and crisis. Is that a fair way of sort of understanding? And in that respect, if that's true, that stands really in direct contrast to the way 1619 wants young people to understand America.
Yeah, I couldn't have put it better myself, Jeff. I mean, it's the driving force of the book that I'm publishing next month, Lincoln and the American Founding. My basic argument is the most important things we can learn from Lincoln are precisely what he teaches us about the founding. And what you learn when you study Lincoln is he wasn't the only one making a claim on the founders. Nikole Hannah-Jones is making a claim on the founders. Today, many different people make a claim about the founding. Very few claim that the founders were wrong. Okay, there are some. Alexander Stephens was the classic example of that, the vice president of the Confederacy. Usually, and in fact, almost to a man, not everyone, but almost to a man in the 1850s wanted to wrap himself in the mantle of the founders. And in fact, Lincoln propelled himself onto the national stage by claiming that he had a more accurate interpretation, a more accurate, correct understanding of the founders than the leading Democrat of his day, Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas constantly referred to our revolutionary fathers our fathers. That was a locution everybody used. Our fathers, our fathers, our fathers. Okay. Douglas claimed that the fathers were white supremacists. And so Douglas was emphatic. People claim that Lincoln played the race card. If that's true, and I don't think he did, that's another conversation. But if it's true, Douglas played the whole deck. Douglas was a categorical white supremacist in a state that was white supremacist. Yes, it was a free state, but it was a state that in the 1850s, if you were Black, you could not vote, you couldn't serve in the militia, you couldn't serve on a jury if a white person was a defendant, and they banned the immigration of Black people who didn't already have residency. If you were Black, you could not move to Illinois. I'm not sure why you would want to, but it was against the law for you to move to Illinois. It was like Illinois and Indiana were competing to see who could be more white supremacist among the free states. Okay, that's the context that we're talking about. And Lincoln steps into that and he says, Douglas, you're wrong. The founders were not white supremacists. The founders believed that the basis of human rights was not one's race, but one's humanity. And therefore, this is something that is true not just for whites here and Blacks here, but true for everybody the world over. He had a very philanthropic understanding of America. If America succeeds and succeeds correctly, this is an example we can set for other people throughout the world. And so when Lincoln says, no, I think you got the founders wrong, this was not a trip down memory lane for him. He wasn't being nostalgic. It wasn't a July 4th sort of thing, a one-off. He was engaging in a fundamental conversation and debate and argument that the nation was having with itself. We were having a civil discussion that turned into a civil war when that discussion failed. When the election produced Lincoln as a president, Douglas, as his rival and of a different party, accepted that outcome. Other Democrats did not, and for them it was, heads we win, tails you lose. And so those people were acting fundamentally un-American by being a political minority, numerically outnumbered, and essentially saying, "Not my president." Okay, they left because their guy didn't win, and they feared what Lincoln would do. But the point here is that Lincoln's directing our attention, as Jason ably quoted, back to the spirit of 76. What Lincoln was doing there was challenging what looked to be, or what looked to become, the prevailing understanding, the prevailing interpretation of the founders. Had Lincoln lost, in other words, if he failed to persuade, using words, the American people that his understanding of the founders was correct, all men really are created equal, even Black people. If the American people said, interesting, I don't think so, hard pass, if they had chosen Douglas, Bell, or Breckinridge, what it would have done is steered our country off the path towards a greater alignment of our practice with our profession, all men are created equal, and onto the fast track to white supremacy. This would have opened the floodgates to slavery in the Western territories, the federal territories, and it's precisely the reason why the Republican Party coalesced and formed in the mid-1850s was precisely to stop that. Under federalism, we couldn't, as a nation, get rid of slavery where it already existed. That had to be done by those states. The question was, what can you do about slavery in the territories? And the Republicans said, don't allow it to go in there. And in fact, Congress, you not only have the authority, you have the duty to prevent it. Stephen Douglas disagreed, and Jefferson Davis disagreed. In either case, had their argument succeeded, their interpretation of the founders was received as correct, then we would have become a slaveholding republic through and through in every state.
Wow, isn't that amazing? So really the 1619 Project, as you both said, is sort of returning us to a bad old argument of the founders being pro-slavery and missing this really precious resource in America that Americans have looked to for inspiration and guidance, that the fundamental principles of the founding are principles of freedom. They're principles of personal freedom, of economic freedom, of religious freedom, of all these kinds of freedoms. And the question is just, are we going to live up to those noble principles? And the struggle of our history has been, what do they mean and how can we live up to those? Yeah, that's a really inspiring story to be able to discover and to be able to tell. Well, I want to thank you both. This time has just flown by. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Lucas, very much for being
Great to
with
be
us.
Thank you.
Just a wonderful way to just think about the 1619 project. Many of you out there, are, as I say, already know about it, but some of you will be engaged with this through your children or your grandchildren or folks you know. Ashbrook provides a lot of resources for us to be able to provide a better, truer history and understanding of America. Look us up, ashbrook.org, for resources, or we have a wonderful site, teachingamericanhistory.org, TAH.org. It's a wonderful site for primary source documents for students, for teachers, for people who are educating their children at home, or grandparents and parents. Take a look, TAH.org. It's fantastic. It provides the true documents and history of America as our panelists have outlined it. So please take a look at that. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. You'll be sent a link after this we've recorded this. So if you want to send this to folks you know to help them think about the 1619 project more accurately and more fully, please do that. We would love to have that sent far and wide to those for whom it would be useful. Don't forget about our American Heroes webinar series. We're continuing even tomorrow with Heroes of American Business. We're going to talk about Henry Ford and Madam C.J. Walker, the first self-made female millionaire in America, and how she succeeded in business. And then we're going to conclude our series with Heroes of American Medicine, talking about Clara Barton and Jonas Salk. So please join us. That webinar is tomorrow. There's information on ashbrook.org on how to register for that. Please do that. And again, thank you for joining us today. We really do appreciate it. It's part of our mission to educate our fellow Americans in the history and principles of this country. We hope you got some of that. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. And as always, thank you for being part of that conversation. Stay healthy, stay hopeful, and of course, as always, stay connected with Ashbrook. Thank you.